Charles Mills is famous for his critique of social contract theory, for his critique of ideal theory, likening it to nothing more than ideology. But in this lecture video, I want to look at his normative theory, what he actually proposes a theory of justice should do, what principles it might advocate, all while rescuing social contract theory. So what is the problem with social contract theory? Well, there are three main issues. First, the problem of, well, is it descriptive? Is it actual? Historical? Is it hypothetical? We can talk about a descriptive model of a social contract if we're trying to describe what actually takes place in a society, how it functions. So in this case, we would say, well, it exists. It's not just a metaphor or something like that. Is it historical in the sense that, well, this did take place centuries ago or at the beginning of civilization, and it kind of explains how governments came to be? Is it hypothetical in the sense that, well, maybe it's a bit more, social contract theory is a bit more normative as a moral issue, such that there actually is no kind of a contract ever that occurred. We can't really see it, but it helps us to make sense of maybe how society works or how society ought to work. Secondly, what's the object of a contract then? Is it to create a society, a state, or both? In the case of certain kinds of social contract theories, like, let's say, Hobbes or Rousseau, it's pretty clear that it's to create a state. But we can also have kind of more morally focused social contracts, maybe in the sense of Kant, such that it is more expansive than just the state. So what actually is the scope of the contract? And thirdly, is it normative as opposed to just being descriptive? So is it the outcome of a collective bargaining agreement bringing morality into existence as a conventionalist set of principles, such that, well, whatever our moral principles are, they are existed constructively through our own coming together and agreeing upon a set of principles? Or as a way of elucidating and codifying pre-existing and objective moral principles, perhaps something a bit closer to the Lockean kind of a framework in social contract theory? Or is it just a thought experiment that's not meant to actually bring into being true moral principles, but rather just generates moral intuitions? It helps us think about certain issues from a different perspective. Now we find the two perhaps biggest criticisms of social contract theory in the liberal tradition, first coming from Carol Pateman with her Sexual Contract in 1988, where she argues actually the whole idea of social contract theory is that, well, it's actually non-sexual, there's a kind of equality among the sexes, and she tries to show actually it's still patriarchal in its existence. Charles Mills in 1997, then influenced by Pateman, writes The Racial Contract, where he similarly tries to show along racial lines how the social contract theory is not merely, colorblind, but instead actually has smuggled in all kinds of ideological notions about race that influence its normative theory, such that it isn't then, necessarily non-racist or even anti-racist, even though its aims might state that it is in terms of a moral equality among human beings that have engaged cooperatively in the social contract. So we have these huge issues that first make social contract theory a bit ambiguous. What actually is it doing? What do we want it to do? And secondly, whether or not it actually can promote its stated aims of liberal equality among all human beings. So the question Mills wants to address is whether it's possible for social contract theory to be used for progressive purposes. Carol Pateman thinks no, that it necessarily is imbued with these sexist and racist presuppositions. But Charles Mills isn't so sure, and he wants to go back to the first social contract proposed by Rousseau and the Discourse on Inequality. Because this is the kind of articulation of a social contract that Mills thinks isn't really taken seriously, or at least not seriously, as a normative tool for thinking about justice or injustice. Now, in the Discourse on Inequality, when Rousseau tries to answer the question, what is the origin of inequality? And he talks about how society is founded. And he basically says, well, the whole reason that society was founded out of the state of nature is that you had a bogus contract that was offered by the wealthy to the poor that pretended to secure justice and peace for the mutual benefit of all, but instead it really just subjugated the poor to the wealthy. So we kind of have this critique of the origins of society, such that there was this bogus, this fake, this exploitative contract that originally founded society. Now, this can be contrasted with his articulation of normative social contract theory in his work, The Social Contract, in 1762, where he tries to offer a normative account of what a justified government would look like according to an ideal social contract. So what Mills calls this original, more protean social contract that Rousseau offers in the Discourse on Inequality, and what Mills really wants to highlight and focus on as the more ideal kind of social contract theory we should be working with, he calls it the domination contract. And basically, a domination contract is a demystificatory methodology that uses the idea of a social contract, but only as a strategy for theorizing domination within a contract framework. So this kind of concept of social contract seeks to identify certain kinds of contracts, whether they be a sexual contract, a racial contract, a more class-based contract, and to expose the ways in which it is unjust. So what Mills wants to do then is create a kind of synthesis between this more domination focused contract of the earlier Rousseau and what most social contract theorists work with a kind of more normative social contract. And he does this by focusing on what he says are the two virtues of social contract theory. The first virtue is its capturing of the crucial factual descriptive truth that society and polity are socially constructed. And he thinks this is seen, of course, in both Hobbes's and Rousseau's contracts, because in the case of Hobbes, well, the whole construction of society is it's constructed by so how human beings relate to one another. It's constructed by the contract in the first place. It's constructed by society and the roles bestowed onto people by the sovereign. So this is a critique of the Aristotelian, more kind of natural law theory model, which says, well, humans are naturally social beings, and so the life in a city is natural. There's a certain arrangement of a city which is more natural that helps it flourish for certain natural ends. And what we find in Hobbes and Rousseau with their social contract theories is actually the kind of social life that exists in modern life is entirely a construct. There is no correct or natural way that society has to or should be constructed. So this allows us, Mills thinks, to better easily critique certain kinds of practices or norms that we find in society because they're not necessary, they're not natural. The second virtue of contract theory, he says, is the contemporary contract focuses on the moral equality of contracting parties and its normative implications for socio-political structures. Kant's and Rawls's social contracts are chief examples of this. And Mills says, while it's true that society and the state are human creations, it is obviously false, as mainstream contract theory classically implies, that all adult humans are equal contractors, have equal causal input into this process of creation, and freely give informed consent to the structures and institutions thereby established. Rather, it is the outcome of the collusion among themselves of a social group with far greater influence, who have their own self-seeking agenda. The real contractors, in the sense of those who are controlling things and know what is going on, are the rich. Similarly, in Pateman's sexual contract and my racial contract, men and whites, through a mixture of force and ideology, subordinate women and people of color under the banner of a supposedly consensual contract. So the goal will be to have, on the one hand, a kind of social contract theory that is critical of the failures of actual social contracts, and we know they're not necessary or natural because, well, the roles and the organization of society is entirely constructed. And secondly, that we critique those unjust contracts in order to pursue true moral equality among all human beings. So we actually want to have the same goal as what normative social contract theorists like Rawls pursue, but through different means. So what Mills does is he shows side by side all the different kind of suppositions and the differences in methodology that we can look at the mainstream contract and the domination contract. So the kind of ethical framework or the methodology for the mainstream contract is ideal theory versus non-ideal theory. The starting point for mainstream contract theory is ground zero. It's a state of nature or an original position. So it's in this sense ahistorical. But for the domination contract, the starting point is an unjust stage of society because we're identifying there is an injustice. We begin from that injustice, not from what justice is in the abstract. So the role of history for mainstream contract is non-existent. But for the domination contract, there is a historical account presupposed. There's a whole narrative that's taken into account. In terms of the individuals that are involved in contract theory, for the mainstream contract, Mills says you have people as pre-social atomic individuals. But for the domination contract, you have people as members of social groups in relations of domination and subordination. So all of their background, their history, their characteristics, their beliefs, their class, their sexual orientation, all of that kind of stuff is taken into account. It's not just abstracted away. Now, the status norm in society for the mainstream contract is ostensible equality, because it's not only that this is what mainstream contract theorists are aiming for, but this is also then what they begin with. As we're in the domination contract, the status norm in society is explicit inequality, right? So we begin with this fact, and we want to understand how can we unravel this? How can we overcome this? Economic transactions in the mainstream contract are typically mutually beneficial. But in the domination contract, they're typically exploitative. Things don't work, for everyone through a kind of maybe Kantian ethical framework of treating everyone as an end in themselves. But there is actually people being taken advantage of. And the question is how and why. The juridico-political sphere for the mainstream contract is egalitarian. Whereas for the domination contract, it recognizes that it's biased toward certain dominant groups. So continuing, the human divisions we have in the mainstream contract are class, race, and gender, which are considered as natural. They're kind of presumed. But in the domination contract, class, race, and gender are artificial. They're social constructs. For human psychology, the mainstream contract says it's basically imported from nature. But the domination contract says it's fundamentally transformed by society. And we can think about this in that classic Rousseauian terminology of amour de soi, the kind of natural love of self, of just a kind of basic self-preservation, versus amour propre, which is a kind of more socially constructed love of self, which really is a kind of egoism. Now, the obstacles to accurate social cognition for the mainstream contract are individual bias, passions, inclination, and short-term self-interest. So we can kind of see it's really ahistorical, universal problems. But for the domination contract, they're more historical, more cultural, more specific, insofar as they are dominant group interests and dominant group ideation, which can differ from place to place and time to time. So the locus of problems for mainstream contract theory is human nature, whereas for the domination contract, it's corrupting social institutions. The goal of the contract, then, for mainstream contract theory is to create a just society, which involves theorizing ideal laws, ideal government. But for the domination contract, it's to reinforce and codify unjust institutions. At least that's the idea that the domination contract says of how contracts work that they want to dissolve. So what's the heuristic purpose for us? Well, for the mainstream contract, it's for readers' endorsement of the contract as creating an ideally just society. But for the domination contract, it's readers' condemnation of the contract and corresponding awakening to systematic social injustice and the need for appropriate corrective measures to realize a just society. So in looking at the kind of aims of the differences between the mainstream contract theory that we might find in, for example, Locke and Kant and Rawls, and then looking at the kind of more domination contract, which is a much more critical of contract theory that we might find in Pateman and, of course, Mills and even the earlier Rousseau, Mills still wants to embrace contract theory. He says it's social contract theory is still useful because we can use it to identify injustices and then we can see what it is we have to dismantle. But, of course, this wanting to continue and embrace social contract theory comes with a lot of objections. So he considers 8 objections. The first of which is that the domination contract is an idle fifth wheel. It doesn't even engage in normative theorizing, at least the way that he's talking about wanting to embrace the domination contract. But Mills's response is that it's a matter of conceptual orientation and of heuristic value, not of logical implication. So his use for the domination contract is not to show that some kind of principles logically follow and therefore we should endorse them, but instead to change our perspective, to reveal something that we've taken for granted, and to realize its unjust nature. Secondly, contract is just a metaphor and doesn't actually explain anything. So why use contract if it's not actually something we see in society? It's just something that's a kind of legacy of philosophy. Mills's response to this is that the domination contract is not meant to substitute empirical sociopolitical investigation. So it's going to still rely on the work of sociology, of history, of political science, of psychology even. So instead then, what it does is complement these kind of empirical investigations by providing a level of abstraction that's appropriate to political philosophy. That can sometimes even question maybe the concepts that these more empirical disciplines use. Third, endorsing this apparatus ties one to a liberal framework. Mills's response is, well, this is actually a virtue, not a weakness. But importantly, it is liberal only in terms of its values of universal equality, not in its social ontology. This is one important way in which he's going to distinguish himself from Rawls. Fourth, liberal values themselves are suspect. Perhaps this is because liberal values are too individualistic. Mills's response is, well, what's wrong with moral equality, autonomy, self-realization, equality before the law, due process, freedom of expression and association, voting rights, and so on? And he says, well, look at all these other perhaps alternative ideologies. Marxism. He says, yeah, it's great for, critiquing capitalism and class conflict, but it's weak on moral issues. Look at communitarianism. It's vulnerable to charges of relativism, and it's weak on individual rights. Post-structuralism. Yeah, it might be great at, criticizing the way that, certain binaries in language and things like that might be perhaps unjust or illegitimate, but it's weak on actually positive reconstructions of then how we should reformulate society. And then even care ethics. Even if we need something more than justice, which care ethics says, Mill says we still need justice. and care ethics doesn't offer a theory of justice. So what's wrong with liberalism then? Fifth, mainstream contract theory takes minority concerns into account. So it can already be revised such that it can address cases of sexism and racism and so on. But Mills's response is that formal inclusion needs to be distinguished from substantive inclusion. He never denied that formally, yes, in the theories, mainstream contract theory has taken minority concerns into account. But the problem is, in its methodology, it makes it incapable of actually implementing substantive or concrete inclusion. 6. Mainstream contract theory, as an ideal theory, is not trying to do what you want to do as a non-ideal theorist. So what's the problem? You just have different aims. You have different things. He says, well, if the task of political philosophy is to generate normative ideals, then at some stage, the ultimate goal must be to bring these ideals into comparison with our own non-ideal society. So we can't just say that ideal theory is interested in something else, because even if you say that its first order interest is the kind of ideal of justice, it's still, for it to be of any value to political theorizing at all, must take into account its relation to non-ideal issues and how to actually implement justice and address real issues of injustice. So no matter what, it actually has to be interested in what I'm involved, or what I'm interested in, Mills thinks. 7. The apparatus of social contract theory cannot be reclaimed and turned to progressive ends. So here we have the Pateman objection again. Mills's response is that the history of the contract shows it's actually flexible enough to be radicalized and subjected to reconception. He uses Rousseau as an example with the first formulation of the domination contract, and then Oken later on in Justice, Gender, and the Family when she tries to use social contract theory to show, to criticize actually the private-public distinction in political philosophizing. Finally, number 8. If all kinds of complexities and epicycles are needed, isn't the original metaphor of the contract lost? Such that, well, if you want to say society is much more complex than ideal theory is able to account for, then isn't just the idea of a contract a little too simplistic? And he says, yes, adequacy to the field of study is more important than simplicity. Society is complex, but that means then the metaphor should be complex as well. And he thinks that's why his account of the domination contract is complex enough to successfully describe the injustices that actually occur in society. Now, what does a normative theory of justice, a non-ideal theory of justice, using social contract theory, specifically in the vein of the domination contract, look like? What Mills does is he says, well, because Rawls is so dominant, he's going to adapt Rawls's methodology for non-ideal purposes. And he says to do that, we keep the original position, this idea that everyone comes together to unanimously agree to one set of principles. But what we do is we change the veil of ignorance. We make it thinner. It's not as thick. It's thinner, so it does include, it lets pass through certain kinds of social knowledge that individuals in the original position are aware of. Specifically, certain kinds of social knowledge that blacks have historically suffered from, unequal or zero citizenship with equal status in civic sphere, or proportional political input into the governing process. So individuals in the original position are aware of this historical and social fact. Secondly, that racial exploitation and economic marginalization have historically plagued blacks. And third, blacks have historically suffered from ontological stigmatization of the group as inferior, lesser beings because of their racial membership. Now, once this thinner veil of ignorance is included, such that participants in the original position are not then dealing kind of ahistorically, but they're dealing with historical issues and trying, in thinking together, in dialogue, trying to unanimously agree on a set of principles that would then address this historic racial injustice. Mills asks, the question then is, what principles would you choose to dismantle a racialized basic structure and a racialized social ontology that is founded on a racial contract? The principles that Mills thinks would be chosen in order to address racial injustice basically mirror the kind of principles that Rawls thinks would be endorsed in the original position in his ideal theory of justice. So what Mills does is he lines them up side by side. On the left, we have Rawls's principles that he thinks would be unanimously agreed to, and on the right, Mills's principles of corrective racial justice that would be agreed to in the original position. So, whereas for and these are lexically ordered. So basically, the first principle that's a priority for Rawls would be the principle of equality that regulates ethico-juridical primary goods. So basically, one's equal citizenship. Likewise, then, the first principle of corrective racial justice would be the principle of ending racially unequal citizenship. Secondly, for Rawls, after the first principle of justice, we then get to the difference principle, which regulates material primary goods and basically then one's place in the socioeconomic system. Likewise, for a corrective racial justice principle, we have ending racial exploitation. So the kind of racially focused principle within that idea of the difference principle. And then the third lexically ordered principle of justice in Rawls's principles of justice, that of self-respect, which is the most important primary social good. The racial version of that would be to end racial disrespect. So I think the question that arises is to what extent this kind of non-ideal theory of racial corrective justice within a social contract theory framework is successful as a kind of non-ideal theory methodology. And I want to consider two things that Mills says about his methodology. So first is that he says, as Marx envisaged a classless society, so the sexual and racial contracts, emphasizing the constructed nature of gender and race, open up for us the possibility and desirability of a genderless and raceless society. Is that an issue that the end goal is still basically the same as Rawls and the other kind of liberal social contract theorists, that the end goal is a raceless and genderless society? And I'm thinking about this because this is something that Iris Marion Young, for example, criticizes as just kind of perpetuating the logic of identity and a mistaken conception of what identity actually is. Secondly, Mills says that he's not denying that the question of what kind of public policy will in fact be justified by these principles of racial corrective justice, because it'll be a hugely controversial topic. It'll be debated by policymakers. But if that's the case, if you don't exactly know what kinds of public policy would be advocated by these principles, because this would need to be debated, then have you really advocated a non-ideal theory of justice if you can't actually immediately, by knowing what those principles are, articulate what actually needs to be done to address these kinds of injustice? Or is that just an inevitable fact that, well, it's still kind of philosophizing, even if it's a kind of non-ideal philosophizing? And so that kind of a question really is maybe for political science or politicians. So are these problems for his non-ideal methodology, or does he successfully articulate a normative non-ideal theory of racial justice within the framework of social contract theory?